Welcome to Part 11C. Origin Systems and Richard Garriott, nicknamed Lord British, as he was half English, was going ahead full steam with the Ultima series. Although the games had previously had good success on the Apple II since 1980, it wasn't until 1985 and 1986, when Ultima was released on the Commodore 64, that the game really had its mass market appeal. Set in Britannia, a sort of medieval fantasy version of Britain, and it would be this series that would first successfully bring the fantasy role-playing world to gamers. 1985 would also bring the great beat-em-up Way of the Exploding Fist by Melbourne House, which took all that was great about Karate Champ in the arcades and brought it to the home computer. Over on the Spectrum was a brilliant School Days by Microsphere, where you got to play a school kid called Eric, and you must steal your terrible end of term report from the headmaster's safe. The game was imaginative and fun, and what was particularly great was that you could rename all the teachers and pupils in the game to your friends and teachers, meaning that you could virtually get your revenge on the real teachers who would give you extra homework. The game was such a success that it would quickly have a sequel called Back to School. This followed on from the first game, having to sneak in a glowing end-of-term report into the headmaster's safe to replace the one that you'd previously nicked. The sequel was more of the same, but added a lot more antics for you to enjoy. In May of this year, Commodore gamers would finally get what Specky gamers had previously enjoyed with their own decent games magazine, called Zap 64. It would keep all the humour and tone of Crash, but for the Commodore. It would go on to be another huge success for Newsfield Publications. 1985 would also be the year that the budget game publisher would first hit the big time. First we had Mastertronic, who would release games under a confusing array of publisher titles, such as Arcadia Systems, Bulldog and Ricochet, but they all had one thing in common: they all sold for a paltry $1.99. Most of their earlier titles were more bodget than budget, but it would be under this label that, in 1985, the brilliant arcade adventure game called Magic Knight by David Jones would first be released and find a place in gamers' hearts. The first game in the series was called Finders Keepers, which had you trying to find a birthday present for the king's daughter so that you can become a knight of the polygon table. In the game, therefore, you had to wander around the kingdom, collecting up and solving puzzles. For the second game, the title would be released under Mastertronic's new label called Mastertronic Added Design, or MAD for short. This meant that the game would be a whole pound more expensive, selling at $2.99, but with the upshot being that it should be a better quality game, and in this case it certainly was the case, for the game released was called Spellbound, and this time it was a much more of an arcade adventure than the first, with puzzles and innovative windowing system, with it being well ahead of its time. Nighttime, released in 1986, was the third game in the Magic Knight series, and it had you play the poor old Magic Knight who had been accidentally transported to a spaceship in the 25th century instead of medieval England. And then, finally in 1987 would be Stormbringer, and this would have you play Magic Knight again, where he must find his alter ego. 1986 would bring the first major rival to Crash on the Spectrum, with the massively funny mag called Your Sinclair. It had started out as Your Spectrum since 1983, but it wasn't really until the name change that the magazine really found its feet. It would be this magazine that would bring the brilliant Stuart Campbell and Jonathan Davies, who would continue to be such journalist veterans in the magazine Amiga Power years later. The renamed mag was originally brought about to coincide with the new Sinclair machine being released called the QL, standing for Quantum Leap, and being geared this time for business users. However, turned out to be an embarrassing footnote before Sinclair would finally be sold off to Alan Sugar's Amstrad company. Later in the year, Amstrad took over Sinclair, and they would release the Spectrum Plus 2, which was the Spectrum Plus 128 with an inbuilt tape deck. The following year they would also release the Plus 3 variant, which had its built-in floppy drive as well. Another massive developer for the time was the brilliant Denton Designs. They had already brought the world the fantastically surreal Frankie Goes to Hollywood game in 1985, but in 1986 they would outdo themselves with a brilliant isometric adventure game called The Great Escape, released for Ocean. The game had you play a British prisoner of war veteran who, like in the film, wants to escape a Nazi's prison. The game was no action-fueled Steve McQueen outing, instead being a far more strategic and thoughtful affair as you dug tunnels and collected things that you needed to avoid being caught. The game had a lot of depth for the time, and it almost makes me forgive Denton Designs for the travesty Transformer license, also released this year. I said almost. Still, in 1987 they did come out with the brilliant 128K exclusive Spectrum title called Where Time Stood Still. The game was an isometric adventure very much in the graphical style of The Great Escape, but this time it was set in the Lost World setting, full of dinosaurs and native cannibals. But anyway, back to 1986, and Jeff Crammond, he of Revs fame, would release the wonderfully surreal strategic game called The Sentinel, which had you roam around a fantastically realised 3D world as you fought to save Earth from the absorbing Sentinel by counter-absorbing. It was kind of like a multi-layered 3D version of chess. The game was great, providing you could get your brain around the original game, but once you did, you would be hooked. Another game character forgotten in today's world was the brilliant Jack the Nipper, released this year. In the game you played Jack, who is a baby who must be as naughty as possible whilst avoiding being spanked and getting a sore bottom. The game was great, borrowing heavily from Sweeney Toddler comics in Whizzer and Chips at the time, and retaining the great cartoon visuals. If ever there was a game begging to be remade in today's world, it would be this. They did release a sequel called Jack the Nipper 2 in Coconut Capers, which had Jack and his family deported to Australia, but en route Jack would escape and again try to be as naughty as possible while avoiding his dad, who was in hot pursuit. This year, Hewson and Andrew Braybook's company Graphgold would release a brilliant space shooter called Uridium that was majorly fun to play, being a real polished space blaster. Don Priestley, who had become known for his massive in-game graphics on the Spectrum, had already in 1985 brought out his own arcade adventures Popeye and Benny Hill's Madcap Chase to a delighted world. But in 1986 he released The Trapdoor, which was based on the brilliantly surreal Plasticine TV show of the time. In the game you played Bert, who must make his way around the castle collecting ingredients for his master's lunch and do chores. Mike A. Richardson this year would release his best work, and when you consider his other games were Harrier Attack, Scuba Dive and Thanatos, that's no small feat. The game was called Turbo Esprit, and had you play a special agent who must drive around in his Lotus anywhere in the city to smash the drugs ring. What was fantastic about the game was its scope, with an entirely fully functioning city to drive around. It would be this sandbox city that would so inspire Grand Theft Auto and the Driver games years later. Also this year, Alter Ego by Dr. Peter Favreau had you play out a virtual life through making life choices throughout the game to see where you would end up. The game was surprisingly good fun, and you could tell a lot about yourself based on the decisions that you would make. Thank you for listening to Part C. Please go on to Part D.